Every week we do a Q&A with interesting and accomplished members of the adaptive community to find how they persevered, how they innovated, how they built communities, and how they found solutions. Welcome to the Nametags Chat Podcast. Welcome to the Nametags Chat Podcast, where we talk with interesting and accomplished members of the adaptive community. Today we have Eli Wolff, who is a two-time Paralympian in the sport of soccer, seven-a-side soccer. He was influential in getting athletes with disabilities to be award winners at the ESPYs. This is kind of interesting. So helping to change Major League Baseball from calling it a disabled list to an injured list. That fits really well with what we're going to talk about. Was supportive of Casey Martin, who was a golfer who was trying to play on the PGA Tour and use a cart because he had a circulation issue with his leg and so couldn't walk as well. Eli coordinated efforts to include sport within the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. His work focuses on the intersection of research, policy, and practice to advance sport and human rights development and social change. So Eli, thank you very much for joining us.
So great to be here. Thank you.
This is cool. So the whole idea of human rights, I mean, it's human rights, it's sport, it's a really big question. So, and it becomes personal, right? I mean, this for you became personal as a little kid, right? I mean, this is how you get started on this stuff. How did you get involved? How did you get involved in disability advocacy, but also get involved in sport after a disability?
Yeah, so actually it's a little bit of my family background and kind of how I was growing up. And then obviously the disability piece, but growing up, there was always a big emphasis on social justice or community engagement, on academics, and also on sports. So those three things were always big growing up. My grandfather actually clerked during Brown versus Board of Education with the Supreme Court. And so it was kind of like in the mix or in the DNA there of like kind of just learning and being aware of kind of social justice issues. And then for me, kind of with having a disability at the age of 2 and then getting involved in academics and sports and going along the pathway there and just recognizing some of the issues of equity and inequity pretty early. And then I went to boarding school up at Milton Academy here in Boston. Mm-hmm. And so you just start to see a lot of things. And I first learned about adaptive Paralympic sport at Milton at Mass Hospital School. I was at Milton Academy, and I was traveling over to Mass Hospital School. Actually, Sebastian DiFrancesco was one of my early mentors who kind of brought me into the Paralympic adaptive sports space. But yeah, I think, and then after through college, I then got connected to Richard Lapchick. And Richard Lapchick is sort of like the human rights person and social conscious of sport, for particularly racial justice. And so I was bringing in the disability piece, but I slowly recognized that disability is just a lens, a part of the question, a part of the conversation. And then I started to look more at kind of the human rights dimensions of sport. And that's kind of where I've stayed for like a long time now. So.
It's interesting you talk about the family DNA, right? That your grandfather clerking during Brown versus the Board of Education, which obviously was at big ramifications within Boston as well. And so it's also interesting though too, like how did you start in sports? So you said you had a stroke when you were 2 years old, so you're ambulatory, but affected on one side. Were you like the other kids? Did you go to soccer? I mean, soccer, you graduated from high school in 95, so soccer was bigger. It wasn't as big as it is right now. But did you start just playing
really
soccer? How did that work?
Yeah, my parents really got me into soccer. Like I had the stroke at 2 and I was playing soccer at 4. And I think they just saw that I was really into it, and I developed a passion, and I would get really really focused and really wanted to do well and keep up with my peers, and I was able to stay pretty even, particularly like, you know, elementary school, middle school, and then into high school. And then I was able to keep up even through college. I was able to be a walk-on while I was at Brown, and I was able to train with the Brown team. I wasn't a starter or anything, and they really just allowed me to train, particularly with supporting the Paralympic part of my experience at the time. But high school, I was there. I was part of the junior varsity teams. But I think a lot of it was I had, you know, good speed. I had good field sense, you know, and I combined, you know, soccer. I also played a lot of racket sports. So I did tennis, table tennis, squash, racquetball, you know, all the rackets, badminton. So I really my dad in particular was really sports passionate. My mom, they just really supported me to go for it. And you know, I think it was a great way to connect with my peers, and I developed a lot of my friends, a lot of like moments on the field where I did things that were surprising to probably a lot of people, that kind of got me support or you know, entree into you know, just being recognized as a person, you know, as just like them, you know. And so I think that helped a lot, you know, different goals I scored or things that I did. It was just a way to say, you know, I'm just a regular kid, just I happen to have a disability. And so that I think that was always something that I think I was aware of and paid attention to, that sport was a catalyst for quite a bit. I mean, there were moments in sport that were challenging, that I faced barriers, or, you know, like someone said, oh, you know, made fun of me probably behind my back or something, or I overheard him say something, and I would kind of like try to prove myself in a certain way. But I didn't really learn about the Paralympic stuff until much later, you know, until like toward the end of my high school time. And that was a really like a transition for me, because I had to kind of understand it, because my whole world had been in kind of a non-disabled or able-bodied sport. And so I had to kind of like come to an understanding of what this is and what it is and how does it work. And so I think that's probably where some of my research interests came, because I was just kind of curious, like, what is it and how does it function, and why is it, you know, get the support or lack of support that it does. But yeah, you know, and I was in 1992, my dad took me to the World Cup in Italy. And, you know, so soccer was always like a thing that I just really was like really into and passionate about. And so it's kind of continued. And, but now, you know, obviously really interested in all sports and all aspects of the sports world, but soccer for a long time has kind of been that one journey.
That driving force.
Yeah.
The advocacy part often comes from feeling this sense of exclusion, you know, from feeling separate. But it sounds like from your experience, you were pretty well integrated throughout growing up, and didn't feel any more a sense of separation than any other kid, obviously. And oftentimes separation is an easy thing to feel, kind of no matter who you are. Why did the sport part build or marry with the advocacy part for you? Where did you see the need for this sense of advocacy? Did that happen when you were younger? Did it happen when you were in the Paralympics? How did that come about?
Yeah, no, I think that I always did, even at an early age, like middle school. You know, I always had this kind of advocacy aspect of me. Like, you know, there's a couple stories like in early ages where I would like, you know, take my teachers to the principal's office, and, you know, like I had a PE teacher and a music teacher, and, you know, like the music teacher was making fun of kids that wore Velcro, and I was the only kid wearing Velcro at the time. And I then like went down to the principal's office and like had her reprimanded. And I also had a PE teacher that was like making fun of kids that couldn't do pull-ups at the time. And I also like, I think I did something more expressive. I think, I did something like that, but I didn't get in trouble because like so there was these moments where I was like definitely like showed like some of my fight, but I also I think part of it, fast forward like into like high school, college, I definitely got interested in like community engagement and community service in different ways. And I was particularly interested around like disability inclusion. And I think because I also recognize that I did come from a source of privilege myself and my family. So I did kind of recognize like the potential privilege and power that I might have and that I could bring because of my journey and, being at Brown and doing things that I could perhaps be a source that could help to facilitate some awareness of these broader issues, even though it wasn't necessarily affecting me personally. It was things that I saw systemically, and that was like when I was in college, I did a national research study through a fellowship where I kind of evaluated the state of disability sport. And I also looked at the state of US Soccer Federation. And so I was able to develop some different advocacy concepts, proposals coming out of that research. So yeah, I think I did think about that a lot. So your question is really right on. Like, I didn't necessarily always experience individual, like consistently, like, I didn't feel like I faced barriers. There may have been times or moments that were a struggle or challenge, and then I was able to figure them out or find a solution. But it was really once I saw the adaptive and Paralympic sport space and kind of the state it was in, and how segregated and disenfranchised it was, and then I started to recognize like this is a lot like the Negro Leagues. This is not like other historical movements in sport that have been segregated. And so I started to learn about that like in college and stuff, and I found that really interesting. And then also like just from the more I interacted with Richard Lapchick and his colleagues and that whole network of people, that kind of got me thinking about a lot. So that was a really rich time of evolving and honestly, I didn't even think about myself as an advocate for a long time. I really resisted that label, and I thought of myself more as like and I still think of myself as an educator, although I've come to embrace the advocate side of things more, in terms of what that means, just because I see advocacy as much a broad array of activities, not just marching in the streets per se, but an advocate is about how you see the world. It's about how you work to change minds. And so that, and I learned that from several colleagues that kind of showed me those perspectives on what advocates do and how it, and I was part of actually a study of a number of advocates that are doing work in different spaces. And so that helped me to embrace that identity a little bit more than I had up until that point. So,
which can be hard, right? You and I are having this conversation as two middle-aged white males, right? And the thing is, like, which group is on the inside? Like, we are that group that is on the inside, but yet as a result of circumstance, we are also on the outside. So in some ways you can see both the view from the inside, from the most empowered group, to a group that is marginalized, and seeing that perception, even going back to those times in school when you kind of, I was thinking of it as when you acted out. I don't know that that's the appropriate way of categorizing it. When you spoke up, when you stood up for yourself, was there a galvanizing effect from your peers? You're the only one. You're the only one in this situation. What was the reaction from the other students? Because in some ways, it also, like, you're the only one, but at the same time, there is sometimes a bit of an adversarial kind of feel between students and teachers, right? You're the one who's sticking up to the teacher who's telling you what to do. What was, did you get that response? Was there the reward for stepping out of line and standing up for yourself?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that these moments early on, I think they definitely did help me to connect with my peers and, you know, kind of normalize some of the relationships, you know, to some of my closer friends. One of my closest friends, this guy Scott, he had like, you know, he was like saying that he had never been to the principal, you know, his entire time. And then something we did, like just being normal, like it got him, you know, we ended up getting sent to the principal's office. And so, you know, I think things like that, like you just try to, you know, make, it's more just friends and you know, peers, and you can be, you know, I ended up, I was also really involved in creative writing over the years. And so I wrote these school plays, and I ended up having a couple of the plays like performed like in the 5th and 6th, 7th grade. But one of the things that ended up was sort of a big moment for me was there was actually a class presentation that came in, like I think it was like 7th grade, and it was really like it was like a disability awareness, but it was like kind of like a really like a pity show. It was really like stigmatizing, and they probably didn't realize that someone with a disability was actually in the audience. And so that got me like really inspired to like write my own presentation for the school, and I asked my friends if they would be a part of it, and so I ended up kind of putting that together, and it was a good thing to do. In retrospect, I think I also felt like maybe like that took it too far. You know?
How did it take it too far? What do you mean?
No, I mean, I think it was a good thing overall. I just think that I may have like not, I don't know, like I just felt like because I kind of wanted to really take it to the level of like developing a really awareness campaign and really kind of become even more vocal about my own story and the whole experience. Like, I just think in some ways I felt like it just made some of my friendships kind of like drifted off in different ways, like from that, or like I think maybe it just became just, I don't know. I just felt like it felt like maybe I went too far with trying in that time, like middle school, you know, like you're trying to do a lot. But it was also,
well, that's a bit of the dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, because you mentioned earlier how some people might have said some things behind your back.
Yeah.
That there was from a potential lack of understanding. And this is an effort to give that understanding, right? To communicate, to educate.
Yeah, it's kind of like how far can you, like,
What is that balance? Yeah.
Yeah, the balance. And actually it was really interesting because somehow this presentation I did, it got, you know, through some colleagues or of my, I don't know, somehow I ended up getting connected as part of this, actually Sarah Reinertsen, and Sarah Reinertsen was also in this book. So this book by Jill Kremens called How It Feels to Live with a Physical Disability. Mm-hmm. And I think it was because of this presentation that I did was big part of the story for my chapter. And Sarah's chapter is actually more about her journey with Paralympics, because she was already involved at the time. I actually was not involved at the time. But no, I think for me, that part of time it was actually a good thing for me to tell my story and learn how to tell my story and start, you know, it wasn't perfect, but I was starting to tell that story. But again, I do think that it, you know, I ended up going to boarding school, and I left the, I would have gone on to the high school. And then I decided to go to boarding school. I think part of it was because I just like felt like I wanted to kind of have a new start, a new place to kind of, because it was really emotional. I think it was just a lot I was sharing, and it just probably was too much at the time. But no, I think that's part of it, is just finding the balance and finding, support and things like that. And I some of my closest friends I'm still friends with to today. But some of them, a couple of them I'm not. So it's just people move on and, do their thing.
Which is the nature of
exactly.
growing up and growing in a different direction, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally, yeah.
Your wife, Sherry Blowett, sent us a message saying that who's, Boston Marathon winner as well. Stella and Spencer say hi. She didn't say anything about whether they're eating all the tortilla chips or not. So I don't know if that's, there might be some left when you're done. So hopefully. But what is the importance of story? I mean, you're talking about story that you might have been sharing too much, but what is the importance of story in affecting a change?
I mean, for a long time, I'm still not great at telling my own story. I definitely do more at talking about the system, talking about the overall problems, the trends, like a big picture, joining on to other people's case. I've worked on a lot of, the case, probably the first big one was the Casey Martin Supreme Court case. And so that was really powerful for me to kind of actually get involved in a big.
How did you get involved in that?
I ended up, I saw the case was happening, and I saw there really wasn't any involvement from the adaptive sport world. And my family are lawyers, and so I started talking to my family about what could be a way to get involved, and they said, well, maybe you could help to organize like an amicus brief. An amicus brief is like a friends of the court brief that could help to support one side or the other, and of course Casey Martin's side, and then I just wrote. I knew Lisa Master Alexis and Anita Mormon, who are sport law professors, who've done various big cases already, and then I wrote to Casey Martin's lawyers, and they said, oh, well, we can do this amicus brief by pulling together the disability sport organizations. And I had reached out to them too to say, would you be interested in joining on this if it could happen? And so that was a good unifying effort to bring the disability sport movement together on behalf of Casey Martin, because part of what they were arguing was that there was going to be a Pandora's box effect if they allow, and basically the argument was that in fact it would not be a Pandora's box, because most people are just wanting to do their own kind of adaptive sport thing, or figure it out in the way that's best for them, not change an entire rule for sport, but yeah, no, I think I have always been interested in kind of those kind of efforts, cases, initiatives that are bigger than myself and aren't really about me, because all this is not really about me. It's not about my story, but obviously my story does play into that. And so actually Sherry's been a big part of, because I've seen Sherry tell her story so well. And so I try to tell my story a little bit more now, but I'm still not always as articulate and eloquent, about it.
I don't think any of us are as eloquent and articulate as we would like. That's for sure. Yeah. Casey Martin taking on the PGA, trying to lobby to play on the PGA. He had a circulation issue with his legs, right? So he wasn't able to walk the full 18 and be able to play. So he was lobbying to be able to use a cart, an assistive device. And yeah, the Pandora's box is that's one of those that the percentage of people who can play on the PGA Tour is a really small percentage of people. But this becomes a high profile case because it is the PGA Tour. You look at him, you look at like an Oscar Pistorius. Obviously, there are a variety of things that happened afterwards that have nothing to do with this part of the story, but petitioning the Olympics to be able to run with prosthetic legs. You were also involved in the ESPYs in helping
And I was a
to
part of the,
celebrate people
yeah.
with disabilities, athletes with disabilities, which is a high profile thing. What's the what's the objective, when you look at this? Because you're trying to affect the change. That idea of the high profile, is that where the change happens, or how does this happen?
Yeah, no, I do feel like by being involved in these kind of cases that and by looking at big institutions of you know by looking at how do organize, I mean, I think it's more about organizational systems, organization systems, particularly breaking it down. So looking at whether it's happening at the Olympic and Paralympic level, whether it's happening at the professional sport level, if it's happening at the NCAA, at the collegiate level. So I've kind of been interested in like how it breaks down at the different levels of sport, but also the role that the media plays. So the media and the way we tell stories. But I do think that that having an impact on cases that do reach the public, that are visible, so people can look to analyze and unpack them and even agree or disagree. But I think a lot of the work that I've been involved in is really to be evidence-based. So like looking at like, why are we taking a particular stance? Like, why does this make sense? And a lot of it is around the whole idea of inclusion and integration. And so how do we really integrate people with disabilities and sport into a more integrated way, rather than having these separate systems and separate like how do we really create an integrated system? But yeah, no, I think that the ESPYs just kind of came. I was working at World Team Sports with Steve Wisnott, and we were sitting around the table and with some of the colleagues there, and he was like, "Oh, we're just talking about the ESPYs," and we are like, "Oh, it'd be so great if the ESPYs were to," and then we had heard that Steve Raymond was also involved, and then I worked with Richard Lapchuk to kind of help to talk to the president of ESPN about it, and then Steve Raymond and I kind of helped to manage it for a while, and then now it's like gone really very much internal at ESPN, but there's still a few of us that are involved in some ways to kind of help. But it's it is nice to see these things happen. It's about the progress. Hopefully it continues to progress, and particularly in the media front. That there's more storytelling platforms. That there's just even recently talking to some colleagues about like just all of them. Players Tribune and all the different. That these are all about story. They're finding great stories, and there's plenty of great stories in the adaptive sports space. So. And it's the tipping point is getting there. I feel like we're getting closer, but we're not quite there yet. But
well, it's interesting that you talk about story that way, because looking at sport, I mean, there are battles. There continue to be battles in sport, right? And we're talking about on the Paralympic, on the disability side of sport, and saying you're looking for more integration, and that makes perfect sense. But then, like another soccer player, like looking at like Megan Rapinoe, right? Who's getting tweeted out by the president, which I just think, I mean, like, how cool that she has the guts to be able to stand up for herself versus the president of the United States. But women looking for equal integration, looking for equal pay. I mean, you certainly look at the minority side of things, where so often if you're clamoring at all for any kind of equality, it's really easy to effectively be replaced, right? Which is great to see a guy like a LeBron James, who's so willing to put himself out there. But the thing is, like, he's a guy who can't be replaced as well, right? So he's taking the initiative to make that happen. But on the disability side, one of the issues, and I know that you've addressed this, is that it doesn't even really get considered. Like you're talking about the visibility, where it is the starting the conversation, having an opinion, but what's that first step of actually being considered, and how do you get into that conversation?
Yeah, no, I think that part of my interest, and you kind of mentioned some of the other athletes and kind of how this is not just about disability, this is across the board of minority and marginalized, and for various populations that are kind of not always in the mainstream or having to address different issues. And I think that's, for me, that's been part of my interest and my work, is also that to be involved at a broader kind of human rights, social justice, and social change level, just because I feel like it's important to learn from other movements and also be a part of other movements as an ally, as a organizer. And so that's, for the last 10 years, I've been involved with the Muhammad Ali Center to kind of have that broader lens of sport and social change and athlete activism. And but I do think it's given me, and one of the reasons why I wanted to also do that is for my own kind of sanity or perspective. Like I felt like I was getting a little bit burnt out of just doing disability work. And I felt like to have more of a balance, it would actually gain my strength and gain my knowledge and understanding to do better in the disability space. And also I didn't see a lot of crossover happening of people from the disability sport movement also working in other movements. So I thought that would be also really interesting to kind of be able to kind of work across in different ways. But one of the things I found overall that really helped me think about disability is it's about finding ways of being at the table, finding ways to actually present ideas in very professional, very organized ways, but also having that access, having the access to the influencers. But also in the recent years of kind of social media, of the ability to do blogging and putting ideas out there more publicly, there is, I feel, a great opportunity for the disability adaptive sport movement to be more vocal, and to call more attention to some of these issues, and I have noticed that the disability and sport movement is a little less vocal, and for many reasons. It's not just because they don't want to be vocal. I think it's something they don't know how to be, or they may be not wanting to lose the little bit that they have, or they don't have the connections or the networks to get to a position. And even if they are in that position, are they prepared to know what to do?
What would you like to see?
So I think there's
looking for the community to be more vocal. What might that look like?
I mean, I just from these last 10 years or so and kind of working across movements and building, I just think it's still a matter of time. It's just a matter of time before. But I do think that there can be some more kind of intentionality, of organizing leaders. I've talked to some different people, like we need to really do more to develop our leaders. Like women's sports has done a great job developing leaders. The LGBT movement is starting even more so to do a good job. The racial and ethnic, Black, Latin, those two particular communities, I would say, are doing, there's all sorts of initiatives and programs, but the adaptive disability is not doing doesn't really have that yet. So, it's just a matter of time, to be told to develop that power,
Well, it's the power and it's the mission as well, right? Because we're talking about sport right now. And there are a few different pillars, I think, of like how change happens, right? So you're involved. I mean, involved, obviously you were an athlete. I mean, I guess you always continue to be an athlete, right? You're always a Paralympian, but then also being involved on the academic side. So doing research on the academic side, but also being involved with like the UN, with creating, with helping, having input into some of these charters and some of these definitions. So you call that almost a legislative kind of side. I mean, there can be the litigation side of things. I mean, you look at like the ADA Act, which came out of some of the demonstration, right, where people were literally crawling up the steps of the Capitol to get people to recognize the issue and to see the people in some ways. So
there's also there's media. There's also, I mean, there's just kind of getting the stories. But yeah, and I think part of it's also just mobilizing together, because there does tend to be just different end goals, like I mean, not everybody necessarily feels like they want to be integrated or fully included, because that may mean they lose power, or they may not have the they may feel like if they are integrated, they're not going to be lost in the mix, and so they're going to not be as the little bit of attention they're getting now, that they may be getting a little bit either the same, it's part of it's that understanding of what the possibilities are. And so I think that that's part of the challenge too, is there's not a lot of it's just not, there's not as much history, so it's understanding that history and realizing what should we be striving for. And I think that we're getting there. There's getting to be more of a sense of why this is important, of why it's important to be included in sport and in society. But I think there's still sometimes I feel like, oh, well, maybe it's better to stay segregated, or maybe it's better to stay separate. And I feel like that's an internal battle. I mean, all these communities, all the movements there's always different opinion, and so I think part of it's just how do you get people moving together, and that's all.
And the together, I think, is the biggest issue, right? Because you talked about this early on, where in some ways, for you starting out as an athlete, it was personal, right? This is you became your own advocate. But you also, like with your class, you found a way to in some ways connect with that class too, right? So it was not just you being an advocate for yourself, but in a lot of ways you were being an advocate for students in general. And it's easy as a student to feel persecuted. And those connections were, one, it's personal, the journey is personal, but two, the connection is personal to the audience as well. And that gets to be one of the biggest challenges, doesn't it, within the Paralympic community, of how to make it personal for the audience, how to make it about them as opposed to about a separate group. How have you thought and researched and looked at that? And
and I think it's just about how are we building allies, and how are we making this so that it really can be a collective. I do think the more that we're able to be a part of the federations, that the more that adaptive and Paralympic sport are just able to be integrated into the sport systems, whether that's at the high school levels, that's at the community levels, whether that's at the collegiate levels. I mean, I think the more that it's just sort of a part of the infrastructure, then the more that there is that relational connection rather than it being otherized. Because I think now there's still a lot of the para-adaptive are separate events, separate organization, it's
stuff with
starting.
NGBs and
Yeah,
these national governing
it's starting
bodies.
to get more. I mean, there's some of the NGBs are starting to get more involved, which is great. And obviously USOPC, that has been a huge progress. I mean, right now you're seeing amazingly a lot of the Olympians and Paralympians really connected. You know, a number of years ago when they had the Olympian alumni, there was a few of us, Linda, Mastandria, myself, a few others, we talked to the Olympian alumni about adding the Paralympians, and there was like 5 years of resistance. And then we finally got integrated, and I feel like that, you know, like these small steps of being a part of these systems, I think that, to me, and I think that having the Olympics and the Paralympics together, you know, I mean, that's such a huge thing. Having the same organizing committee, but I think in many ways it has to drilling it down to the federation. Like right now, of the international federations, I think there's only like, you know, a third of them that there's not many of them are really that involved in the Paralympic side.
They're both governing both the Olympic and the Paralympic.
Yeah,
we're
that
talking
kind of stuff,
a lot about sport, but being involved in Olympism, that's about, you know, the health of the individual, the journey of the individual, but also that connection within the community. And we're talking about, on the disability side, we're talking about 1.5 billion people in the world, right? I mean, 1.5, 1.2, 15% of the population, right? So we're talking about a big part of the population, but in a lot of ways, it's an invisible part of the population. And we're talking about how difficult it is on the sports side of it to get integrated. If it's that difficult on the sports side of it, how much more difficult is it than on the everyday side of it, the general community, the general population side?
I think in some ways sport is a part of the reasons why I find it interesting in sport is because it is such a challenge. It's such, like, in some ways, disability is kind of the oxymoron of sport, you know? In some ways it's like, you know, because sport is so much built around like masculinity and all of these things, that in some ways I feel like part of the challenge of sport is how do we change these institutions that are so entrenched in these norms, you know, to kind of get them to redefine in the ways that they've been redefining over the years on many other areas, and, you know, trying to see if we can get some redefinition. But in terms of general society.
But like the Major League Baseball, you were talking about redefinition, right? Going from the disabled list to the injured list. I mean, how profound a deal was that to go from disabled to injured?
Well, that was 100. I mean, there was that, the terminology had been around for like 100 years. And it really, we first brought it up so 2019 was when they actually through the bylaws with Billy Bean, the chief diversity officer, and Manfred. But actually it's kind of an interesting part of the story is that we had brought this up 15 years before, and they had they sort of like tabled it, and we got a letter from Richard Lapchick, and we all got a letter saying that they would be looking into it. It looked like, but then it kind of just never happened. And but no, we just felt like it would be important just because of the way the words of disabled list were really describing something that it wasn't, because those athletes on the disabled list they're injured, they're not disabled. And so being able to, and the whole notion of it being disabled list, it perpetuates a perception of people with disabilities as being on the sidelines. And so we felt that it would be, even though it's just a simple change of words and language, we felt that the description, to accurately describe it as injured list, just like all the other professional leagues do, is the way that it should be, because it actually describes it as they are. The day that we did like a Twitter study on it, and there was like the 24 hours after was like all the traditionalists being like, this is the end of baseball, like baseball is never going to come back from this. And then like after 24 hours, everyone was like, oh, this is cool. And then it actually took like also a 24-hour cycle for all the journalists and all the media outlets to actually, so all of the everything that was disabled list was to change to injured list. So all the tagline, the ticker lines and all the results in the back of newspapers, and so all of that like changed within like 24 hours. But yeah, the fact that it took 15 years and then 100 years from the beginning, and then yeah, Billy Beane, his background has been, he's the first or second openly gay baseball player after he retired, and Billy was really he had done a lot of work with this, has done a lot of work with the adaptive disability space, and so when he got into a position to have influence, and then when this was revisited with him on his table, he was able to make it happen. But yeah, it's just interesting how things can happen like that, and sometimes it takes a really long time.
Yeah, it takes somebody who actually has a personal connection to feeling like an outsider, to understanding the situation. I remember I had a conversation at one point with somebody who was saying that the word handicapped, which is antiquated now, was actually more flattering than the word disabled. So you're talking about disabled, like the disabled list in baseball, you're unable to perform, hence you're on the disabled list. Whereas like handicapped, like you're looking at horse racing or something like that, where they are promoting betting, right? And so that if a horse is running too fast, they would handicap that horse so that it would carry a bit more weight or whatever, so that then people would be willing to bet on the other horses instead of betting on just the fast horse. And you go, wow, that's a little bit more flattering. So the interesting part of the words really is the words carry a lot of weight, don't they?
Yeah, that's the thing, is these words, and also they mean things in different contexts, and yeah, it's just the language of disability, and just it's so pervasive in our disabled cars, and just everywhere. So it's really hard to be a disabled person in America and the world, because it's just these constant messages of being undervalued, or you're second class, or it's just everywhere. And so for the messages that are kind of you get as a young person, as a professional, you're bombarded by it. And so to get an understanding of a different way of seeing it, it's actually interesting for us with their kids, because we have the two kids, and with some, it's been amazing because they are still like pretty open to, like, a lot of it's just like normal, like playing around in wheelchairs, or doing things one-handed. Like, to them, they haven't quite grasped that this is not like, this is a slightly different reality than most kids are having. But
which is interesting once you see it, right? You're talking about this sense of a barrier, that can be in a word, this idea of disabled being a barrier that affects your ability to be seen as an individual and as your potential. But yet sometimes that story can
just
really
in that context. So
just be that human story,
so
right?
Just in the Major League Baseball context, in that context of Major League Baseball, it's just not, of course, using the term disabled is an important thing. It's the right thing. But in the context of all these other leagues using injured list, so it's not about saying disabled is not a good word to use. It's just saying that's kind of the point of that, is it's, but yeah, some people did interpret it, oh, well, are we not supposed to use disabled now? And so I think that was part of the challenge, is like trying to help people understand, well, that's not the point at all. Of course, disabled is a really good word. It's an important word to use, but when you're talking about this notion of being injured and being on the sideline, but then you're using the word disabled list like that, that's not the right way to. So that's, yeah. But
right, exactly.
It's hard. It's the nuance of trying to that was the challenge of some of these things. Is sometimes it's hard people to get it, because like it's hard to see it in these different ways.
No, I think you're totally right. It's interesting to see what the sponsors, some of this U.S. Olympic and Paralympic, now U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, the name has gone through a change. Some of those sponsors have been intrigued by the image. So we're talking a lot about words, but the image of the athlete, and overcoming is one of those words that kind of gets me, that, but demonstrating what it means to be a great athlete. And I think being a great athlete is that part of doing as much as you can, of finding a way to minimize your weaknesses and maximize your strengths. I mean, this is what every single athlete in the world is looking to do. How important for the movement were these sponsors? I mean, you look at like a Toyota, what sponsored, I think for Tokyo was giving, I think it was up to $3,000 for every Paralympic, every US Paralympic athlete, or like hopeful as well, like supporting throughout. How important is the voice of those major corporations?
I think it really helps. I think it's the more that they're able to stand, to kind of be influential on terms of ensuring it's with all these issues. I think that part of it's been like, what is the responsibility of the sponsors, and how can they have an impact on, I think USOPC has been, a really great leader on, social justice, on disability. I mean, they're starting to take a leadership role and starting to see that this can be a really powerful thing. I think part of it is also kind of like, how does that interrelate to the IOC level, and how does the IOC start? Like, I mean, I mentioned about, right now disability doesn't appear anywhere charter, and but they're involved with the Paralympics, like they're involved, there are all these different things going on with, they just, so the good news is the recent report, their diversity report and human rights report they just released in September, it does include mention of disability for the first time. So we're hoping that that's going to now, when they do the next update on the charter. But I think the US, what the USOPC did with the equal pay, with the name change, I mean,
equal pay for medals.
It creates a dynamic. Yeah, equal pay for medals. It creates a dynamic. I know that there was been I was involved with the discussion about, should we give the money to the to grassroots programs to develop Paralympic and adaptive sport, or should we do the medals? And I said, do the medals, because of what it sets a precedent, and again, going back to your question about getting involved in these cases or getting involved in these things, because it is about how do you kind of create these dynamics, these cases, these moments that are going to lead to, kind of these broader systems, systems change that will have some legacy and people can build upon, and so.
Which is great. I mean, talking about the idea of disability actually being stated in the charter, as opposed to effectively like the other box, check other if you fit into this. Can we take a little bit of a right turn? One of your former teammates, Josh Blue, won Last Comic Standing, right? So he's a comedian. Back in 2012, the London Games was a watershed games as far as television was concerned throughout the world. I mean, Channel 4 came in and just blew it out of the water. The final hour of the coverage every day was the last leg, which was a comedy hour from the Paralympics. So you're looking at this. How much does that legitimize?
Oh, definitely.
The movement when you can actually share a humorous moment?
Oh yeah, no, I think it's part of it, just the innovation, like the creative ways of telling the story. And I mean, I feel like Josh, I mean, it's like he just is. He even on the soccer team, he was the same as he is on stage. Like he's, in some ways, he's not even like acting or anything. He's just being himself. um, but no, I think that the ability to like comedy and social change and being able to make progress through that. No, it's just I feel like that's what hopefully will happen over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years is just more and more kind of innovative approaches and getting people to think outside the box and coming up with new ways of kind of breaking down the storytelling piece. But yeah, and I feel like Josh was really one of the, I mean, I'll be like Channel 4 and then Josh and some of these others that have really kind of helped to pave the way in that regard. But I remember like on the soccer team, we'd always kind of joke. We'd be like, "Oh, you're not being funny," but really he was like being hilarious. We'd like try to pretend that he wasn't being funny.
I asked him how he writes a joke, and he said that he writes on stage, that he's coming up with it as it's happening, which is interesting for a guy with cerebral palsy, because oftentimes we, as the rest of the population, are saying, oh no, this is somebody I might not be able to understand, that it affects the speech. And yet he's moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour and able to create this humor on stage.
Yeah.
That is just surprising. How often is it the surprising part that is the important part? I mean, like you talked about that when you were a kid, that, hey, you were fast and you scored some goals. And that was the thing that surprised some people, got you the position, kind of an equal kind of position.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because sometimes it just got me thinking, because sometimes over the years I've because I try to like, use my intellectual capacity a lot and quick thinking. And I try that approach. And sometimes I'm like explaining like, oh, like I had this stroke, but it didn't affect I kind of have to like justify like
the cognitive part, right?
The stroke did not affect my cognitive. And just so I'm thinking about things. And because I think sometimes like I get a sense people are surprised, or like I'm like have thought deeply about things or something. But no, I think, yeah, cerebral palsy, or people with spastic, like sometimes there is a little bit of a misconception of they aren't quite gonna have it all together. So no, but it's no, but sometimes it's get tired. You get like when I get tired, when I cold, like some things do affect my full like feeling like I'm totally kind of in the moment. But overall, I do feel like one thing that I've probably because my family, my upbringing, like I really try to and that's something I've been passionate about, like thinking about things, and I think it's kind of cool to think, whether it's like being a nerd or whatever. I just think it's interesting to have these discussions and think about these questions.
What's next in the movement?
I do think that the media side of it, the more that we're getting the stories out there, the more that we're really a part of the existing media platforms, and even developing some of our own, being innovative in the media space. I think that's a big thing. I do think that the more that we're seeing the growth of the sports, I do think that the growth of high school and college in particular, like the more that I feel like that's going to be something that is really going to ramp up over the next 10, 15.
And what do you mean by growth in high school and college? How does that work? Is that integrated? Is it separate? Is it both?
Probably a little bit of both, experimental, but I think there's going to be more of like, national championships. And I think we're going to start seeing some of those things at the collegiate level that and even high school, college. So we're going to see more of those pathways happening.
And we see some of that, like with basketball and
but those are
wheelchair
not
basketball,
sanctioned.
those
I mean,
kinds
I
of
think it's going to be more of like, actually being sanctioned within the system rather than, and I think particularly like track and field swimming, and you're seeing a lot with like tennis. But yeah, I mean, I think hopefully basketball will keep innovating and even like involving just ways of getting people really engaged around the sports. And yeah, no, I think that the more that we're seeing the sponsors and like you touched on in terms of the increase of sponsors seeing this as a emerging market. And
value.
I guess I would say just, I think people are going to start caring, I'm seeing incrementally people start to care more. So like the women's movement, the other movements of sport really starting to care what happens to disability. And so it's kind of like feeling like, oh, you don't care about this. Like people actually care and are going to want to be a part of it, are going to want to help advocate or support. I feel like we've kind of over the last 10 years or so been like making the case for why people should care. And I feel like we may be at that point now where people care and we're getting people in positions like yourself, Sherry, many others that are like in positions of leadership that people can care about. And I think that matters a lot.
Yeah. And as you're talking about, like with these college teams, that it could be their team, right? That they're cheering for their team. This is it happens to be a wheelchair basketball team or something along those lines, but it's their team. And so they're emotionally connected and on that journey, which I think is exactly what you're talking about. Well, Eli, thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing to bring awareness, to galvanize a movement, really.
Yeah, no, it's great to just be able to work and have fun and laugh and all. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, good. Me too. Thank you very much. And I'll get to see you in the not too distant future in a couple of weeks, I think, or something like that. Yeah, and so looking forward to seeing you in person, but thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Sounds good. Well, we'll talk soon.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends. Please tell your friends to tune in. This will be a traditional podcast. When it comes out, please like us, please follow us, and we will do our best to bring you another great conversation. Thank you very much and see you next time. Take care. Bye.